With the release of Donkey Kong Bonanza upon us, I think it's about time we take a look back at one of the most woefully unappreciated eras of one of Nintendo's classic characters, because this was an absolute travesty. Now, I personally have always been very vocal about this, but this is one of those things that's kind of slipped through the cracks and people don't necessarily bring it up all the time because there's so many different competing mindsets when it comes to this. But the reality of the situation is Retro Studios Donkey Kong Country games were fantastic, way better than the Rareware ones, with their own unique personality and flair. Tons of content, amazing visuals, great enemy designs, great boss fights, just amazing platformers that at the time were severely underappreciated by the gaming community, because the mindset among Western gamers was that Retro Studios was wasting their time with Donkey Kong when they could be working on a real IP like Metroid Prime. This was the genuine mindset from people when these games were coming out, is that this was a step down in quality, that these games weren't what people wanted, that these games wouldn't save the Wii U, people just attack these games for daring to be 2D platformers, something that actual fans like myself had been wanting to see since the 90s, because Donkey Kong Country had established itself as being one of the best 2D platforming franchises ever made. So seeing Nintendo come back and just surpass what Rareware did with their own internal studio at Retro should have been seen as this monumental achievement in gaming. They were able to recapture the magic while still keeping it fresh, keeping it original, coming up with new characters, new ideas, new concepts that really harken back to that old era while still maintaining this feeling of freshness and originality, right? They were some of the best platformers we got from Nintendo around that period, right? They were spectacular games. And yet, they were hated and derided by so many people for so many petty reasons. You had the Metroid fans seething at not getting Metroid Prime 4 or any other Metroid games for that matter. You had Retro Studios fanboys who genuinely believed that this company was being held back by working on classic Nintendo IPs and would be way better suited to making gritty, mature Western franchises. Their own original IPs like Rareware used to. That didn't work out. You had people who were fans of the Rareware games, who were nostalgia-blinded boomers who could not accept the fact that these games were better than what Rareware did and were a clear evolution, and so religiously continued pushing this mindset that Kremlins were these iconic video game enemies that desperately needed to appear in every Donkey Kong game, no matter what. That was the genuine mindset of these people, going into these games. There was just all of this rage and contempt for these games being what they were for a lot of different reasons, right? And I think this is a very good example of just how these kind of toxic Nintendo fan bases can exist, right? It's very similar. It's very similar to what happened to Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door, right? In a way, much less extreme, but still very much prevalent, where you just have all these people who just obsess over their perceived idea of what the brand should be and get upset whenever it deviates from that even a little bit. Right? There was a lot of talk, that at the time that Retro Studios was one of Nintendo's best partners, and yet you constantly saw people complaining about them working on Donkey Kong. It was such a tragic thing, and I imagine it was a major reason why we never got a third entry, because so many people made it adamantly clear that they didn't want this, they didn't want to see this, that this was like a waste of everyone's time. And so Retro decided to pitch their own original project, which clearly has been in development hell for years, And, now they've unceremoniously dropped it and moved on to Metroid Prime 4, which is going to get buried by everything else that Nintendo's putting out, including a new Donkey Kong, by the way, which is very nice to see. But Bonanza, in a lot of ways, it's interesting because I think this is a really good example of what's going to happen every time some Nintendo franchise has a bit of a downturn in popularity and starts being seen as stagnant. New Super Mario Bros. Went through the same thing. When Nintendo does shake things up, when they do put out a new high quality game, it just looks all the more striking, right? Donkey Kong Country Returns was great at being very similar to the original 2D games, but there was this feeling, this very real vibe that maybe they could do something more in a 3D game. Maybe they could innovate and do something new and interesting. And in the end, that's exactly what they did with Bonanza. Bonanza, because of the Returns games existing, doesn't have any of the stigma that would normally be associating with. Metroid fans can't complain because they're getting Prime 4. Retro Studios fans can't complain because it's not being developed by them. Donkey Kong fans can't complain because it's a new Donkey Kong game. The only Donkey Kong fans I've seen seething are people who, desperately want the Kremlings to return, but I think this game might be the end of that, honestly. Because Nintendo has demonstrated the reason why they're not bringing the Kremlings back, because they want to introduce new villains and new ideas for the franchise. And honestly, more power to them. They should do this. They should innovate. They should move past the Rareware mindset. They should make Donkey Kong its own thing again. And I think with what we've seen with Bonanza, they've succeeded. This is the true evolution of Donkey Kong. This is the next major step of the brand. This is something that is going to resonate with people for years to come. That's going to redefine the brand going forward and kind of establish Donkey Kong as a major Nintendo protagonist again after almost 3 decades of being just kind of seen as a has-been in a lot of ways. This is the second time Donkey Kong has been rebooted, in a sense. And if you think about that for a second, if you think about how well this is going down and how well it's been being received, this is the inevitable future for every Nintendo franchise that's somewhat stagnant or hasn't seen a new entry in a while. F-Zero is clearly getting a new game. Zelda had its Breath of the Wild moment. Pokemon has the Legends games. Fire Emblem had Awakening. You see what these brands are like, and you see these kind of downturns, and then you eventually see just this insanely well-produced, new thing that exists because of those old ones. This is the future of Nintendo, and it could not be brighter.